So if you will get into your base groups, which are your morning group, not morning groups, but your groups that I assign, and if you'll take about 10 minutes to make a note card on dynamic environment, keeping in mind that we really want to refer this back to behavior. So how are behaviors an adaptation to a dynamic environment? So in fact, let's make this adaptations for a dynamic environment as your note card. And so if you'll pause the video here and take about 10 minutes, discuss this in your group, and then come back and have out your notes. We're going to finish your notes for today. Where we stopped in the previous session was on innate behaviors, and so we want to continue by talking about behaviors that require some practice. So learned behaviors, an easy way to discuss it is to explain that they require practice. This is different than needing to mature. So if we look at, for example, territoriality, if you look at a little puppy, they're just going to kind of have accidents and go to the bathroom wherever. However, if you look at a more older animal, you are going to see that they have defined territoriality traits. Or think of like Simba in the Lion King and his little roar, and then he could actually do a big roar. And that is maturation. So it doesn't mean that the big roar is that you have to practice as much as it's just a trait that doesn't appear. Those genes don't begin to be turned on until later in life, when the organism has reached a certain embryonic or development stage. So what we're talking about are behaviors that require practice, require learning, require teaching, require memory. And so what we need to be aware of is learned behaviors are going to require more of an advanced nervous system. So advanced nervous system, meaning that not only are you able to sense and respond, but you're also really able to integrate and learn and remember. And so not all animals can remember. So not all animals will display learned behaviors. Learned behaviors really fall into two categories: associative and non-associative. If you've taken psychology, you will probably have covered this much more in depth than we're going to cover right here. But we do just need to identify the difference between the two. Associative behaviors is where you associate a behavior with a desired response. So the organism learns to do a behavior because they're trying to get something. They're either trying to get a reward or avoid a punishment. So they have associated something with either a reward or a punishment. Non-associative, we mainly focus on habituation. And habituation is actually where you learn to ignore a stimulus. So a really good example is, there's an example with wild animals where every time there's a movement, they're afraid. But they learn to not respond to certain sounds or certain visions. You could think of it as in the classroom, people who get distracted by every little thing and have never been taught to ignore external stimuli. So habituation is learning to ignore certain stimuli. So when you first get a piercing, or maybe you have a certain shirt on, at first maybe the tag is itchy, but then over time you ignore that stimulus. We want to focus a little bit more on associative learning, and the idea that an animal is able to associate to unrelated things normally. The first is classical conditioning, and then we're going to talk about operant conditioning. Classical conditioning is, the main idea is that you have two unrelated stimuli, and you learn to associate them. Now, the most famous example is with Pavlov's dog. And we have to be careful because a lot of times people think that classical conditioning is getting a reward because the dog salivates every time you ring the bell. But that's because for a lot of animals, their rewards are food, and the only way for us to know that they're actually having a response or an association is to see their response to food. So it doesn't have to be associated with food or a reward, but that's just the easiest one for a lot of scientists to study. This example is with a pigeon. This bird is able to identify that when it pecks at this, food will actually come out down here. And so what it usually requires is having the two stimuli happen simultaneously for a very long period of time. So with Pavlov, every time he rang a bell, he gave the dog food. And eventually, he would ring, and the dog would salivate, because the dog knew that with food coming, that meant, with the bell ringing, that meant food was coming. So the dog learned to associate the bell with food. And this is what we do when we train dogs, right? You want a dog to do a behavior, you give it a treat. So it learns to associate that behavior with praise, and it's trying to get that second stimuli, which is your praise. But this can also be, for example, my dog and the doorbell. So if your dog responds to the doorbell, well, it doesn't get a reward when the doorbell rings, but the doorbell means either someone is there that's good, or possibly someone is there that's bad. The main idea about classical conditioning is learning to associate two different things. Operant conditioning is going to be also called trial and error. And this is where an organism has to practice something multiple times in order to get it right. So even though there's some practice and some learning here with classical conditioning, the main idea with operant is trying over and over again until you get the behavior perfect. Versus with classical conditioning, there's no perfection, there's just the learning curve. Here, the learning curve means that it's not right until you reach a certain point. So you see this a lot with playing musical instruments. You see this a lot. A really famous example is a chimpanzee and the stick, learning how to put the stick in to dig the ants out and feed yourself. And so, again, a lot of times we see that it's not usually clear-cut two different things. A lot of behaviors are combination behaviors. We do want to be aware of cognition. So does the animal know that this behavior requires practice? And that's a big question that a lot of animal behaviorists have. Is the animal aware of what it's doing? Next, we just want to talk a little bit about some behaviors that are really a combination of the two, learned and innate. The first set that we're just going to talk about is migration and navigation. So even though migration is really going to be an innate task, some animals are going to have to learn through trial and error how to navigate to the correct place. Now what they do see is that some animals are born with an innate sense of north or south or east or west, but it is really going to sometimes require some practice and some perfection of what's happening. Next we have imprinting. Imprinting is one of the most famous examples of a behavior. Be careful, this is not the same imprinting as happens in the Twilight books. Imprinting in the scientific biological point of view is where a young organism, usually a baby, identifies, we'll call it a role model, and then emulates that role model. So the emulation is the practice. The identification is the innate. It's going to imprint on the first organism usually that it sees. So if you remember the children's book, Are You My Mother? Most organisms do not go around asking, are you my mother? They're just going to imprint and learn from the first thing that it sees. So there's a really interesting picture in your textbook about the scientist who really discovered this phenomenon. Little baby ducks actually imprinted on him, and wherever he walked, the ducks would follow him. They did a lot of experiments, found that sometimes ducks will imprint on an inanimate object, such as another duck on like a set of wheels or a robot or just something that doesn't even move. So really interesting idea that the identification is innate, but that how it emulates is the practice. Communication is really a combination because the desire to communicate is innate, right? Nobody teaches a baby how to cry. You teach a baby how to not cry. The way that you communicate is learned. So the language that you learn to speak, that's based on your environment. That's based on practice. I do just want to keep in mind that communication is more than just sound. So it does include sound. It does include sight. It does include touch. So chimpanzees will groom each other. Organisms will nudge each other. But it also will include chemicals. And we don't realize it as humans because our ability to sense chemicals as smell and taste are kind of limited compared to other organisms. But when you think about where like a dog urinates and they're always sniffing each other, that's an example of a pheromone, a chemical that's released. When you think about how ants follow a trail, those are pheromones. Pheromones are also going to be used for mating, so helping attract a mate. And there is a wonder if mammals, including humans, are actually attracted to their mate through pheromones. So you may not be aware of why you're attracted to someone, but there is the idea that maybe it's the chemicals being released by that other human's body. Courtship and mating. So the desire, again, is going to be innate. The urge to find a mate is innate. You must do that in order for your species to reproduce. And so that's a huge adaptation to have a desire to find a mate. But the actual strategies, the courtship strategies, are going to be a mixed bag. Some courtships are going to be an innate behavior. Others are going to be a learned behavior. So we do want to kind of realize that there can be advantages and disadvantages and practice involved. Raising young, so again, the desire is innate. The desire to provide protection to your young to help ensure that they grow up to reproduce and pass on your genes, that desire is innate. But how you raise your young, we of course know there's a big learning curve, especially the more sophisticated your organism gets. So with humans, we know there's a lot of learning to do if you're raising a little human. The last thing is the idea of altruism and societies. And this is actually a really interesting phenomenon. So a society is where you live together and communicate. And so this is sometimes going to be innate, and sometimes it's going to be learned. So the desire, again, to live in a society is usually innate, but how you cooperate and communicate is usually learned. Altruism is the idea that you might self-sacrifice for the survival of the rest of your lineage. And so a lot of times they'll see altruism is an adaptation that is an advantage if you're sacrificing for your immediate family that shares your genes. Some societies, they'll see self-sacrifice for organisms that are not related to them. So if that organism doesn't share your gene lineage, is it a good adaptation to sacrifice for them? That really wouldn't be considered an adaptation because it doesn't help your lineage survive, but could help your species survive. So what we're going to do next is look at a set of cases, a set of 2 experiments on the honeybee. Turns out that the honeybee is actually a very sophisticated set of insects that live in a society, that use navigation, that use communication, that have courtship strategies, that have ways to raise their young, that have differentiated roles in societies. They're going to show a lot of different behaviors. So there's 2 different articles. One is a 4-page article. The other is a 3-page and plus a second article that goes with it. So if you'll just make sure that you split those articles up, you're spending the rest of today reading and annotating those articles.